Chapter 8. Golden Boy, Brass Man. Like my mother, my sister had a taste for gangster types. She started dating one of the vatos from Tokerstown when she was just in junior high school. We had known Ronnie Galindo and his family since we were in preschool together. He was a tall, lanky kid with long arms, long neck, long legs, and a funny, friendly disposition. He was a very likable, albeit menacing and mischievous kid. There was no doubt about it. He simply had a penchant for trouble. He started young, busting the window of the local bike shop in the middle of the night. He and his friends stole a dozen bicycles, hiding them in a nearby garage, and then selling them to the kids in the barrio for $20 each. He got busted and went to juvenile hall for the first of many long stays there. He actually enjoyed being locked up in the hall. He said the food was good. They gave out cupcakes and cookies with lunch, and had a milk dispenser that you could go up to and refill your glass as many times as you wanted with fresh, ice-cold milk. They played baseball, and he learned to draw in his cell. He was, like my junkie friend Crow was, an unbelievably talented artist. Like many career convicts who have loads of time on their hands and nothing else to do with it other than draw pictures, usually of roses, lowrider cars, and beautiful cholas with big, feathered, bouffant hairdos. He became so remarkably good at his art that when he got out, he would tattoo all the homeboys in his gang. He made a little business out of it and saved enough to buy into the drug trade in the neighborhood. He started selling meth and established himself as a player around town. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade, in spite of being a straight-A student. School was easy for him, as were sports, as was the gangster life. He had an ease and grace even in the most harrowing of circumstances, laughing out loud with glee when rival neighborhoods pulled drive-bys, firing shots that came whipping by his head. He'd be leaping over fences, running through backyards, high on PCP and meth, and laughing out loud, screaming, "Tokerstown Kerifa!" Always with a smile. That was just Ronnie. Big bad Flacco. He graduated from juvenile hall to Theo Lacey, to Chino, to Susanville, to San Quentin, and many other California correctional facilities. There was very little in the way, however, of correcting the behaviors of the convicts that landed in those hellholes, and a good many things to further corrupt and derange already troubled minds. A steady diet of violence, drugs, isolation, gang politics, terrible food, and idle time warped and frustrated prisoners, and only made them more bitter and hell-bent on self-destruction. And fuck, who the hell could blame them? The courts levied their judgments, handed down their verdicts, their sentences, but that wasn't enough. Even if you served your time, you'd get out and have to face the judgment of parole agents, cops on the street, potential employers, not to mention rival cliques. They all wanted a piece of you, to see you fail and go right back into that revolving door that is the criminal justice system. It was nothing short of perdition. He finally stood before a judge who had had enough of his reckless behavior and handed down a heavy sentence. 15 years in Ironwood for weapons possession. Ironwood was in the middle of the desert about 100 miles north of the Mexican border. The summers there were sweltering and crammed to the hilt with some of the most notorious criminals in the system. Ronnie and my sister had long since broken up, but they had stayed good friends and kept in touch through letters. My sister was very close to his sister, Connie, and the two would even pay him visits and would put money on his books for commissary. It was Ronnie's sister who invited my sister and I to move into the Galindo family home on Ash Avenue in the heart of the barrio, across the street from Lemon Park. Their mother had moved out to Corona, but rented out the house to Connie and her 5 kids. They had 2 more rooms to spare and needed renters. They were like family to us, so we felt quite comfortable there. It was a house that we were very familiar with, and it was nice for my niece to have other kids, some of them very close to her in age, to play with. They even had a scruffy old, white, long-haired mutt named Mop that Mona could play with. I only had a few things to move in. I took Ronnie's old room. I bought a new bed and a small desk for my computer, my clothes, and a TV. My sister and niece had the room next to me and slept in bunk beds. I got settled, slept well that first night, then woke early in the morning to a very bright and beautiful day. The thing that struck me right off was how fresh and fragrant the air was. You could smell the jasmine, the orange and lemon blossoms, the roses, the fresh-cut grass, all simmering in the warm sun. You can hear roosters crowing in the neighbor's yard across the street, and the elote man ringing the bells on his pushcart as he passed our house. I had spent so many years in the heart of downtown L.A., with its buses screaming by under my window, their fumes wafting into my room, the smell of piss in the gutters, the stale beer from the bar downstairs, street lunatics screaming and ranting, the commuters rushing and piling into trains and crowding the sidewalks, that I had forgotten what it was like out in the quiet suburbs. You could see the snow-covered mountains to the northeast, the sun bright and fresh, free from the shadows of skyscrapers and smog. I got in the van and drove around the neighborhood. As I drove through the barrio, I saw many faces from my past. Old homeboys I hadn't seen in ages, still standing on the same corners or sitting in the same lawn chairs in their front yards, listening to the same oldies, drinking 40s and holding it down. Their faces older, fatter in some cases, more scarred, more ravaged with attrition. I'd wave to them, get out for a second for some hugs and handshakes, tell them we'd hang out soon, that I was back in the neighborhood. Then I drove down Commonwealth Avenue past my elementary school, my junior high school, then down State College Boulevard, past my high school and the Cal State Fullerton campus, where my whole family worked for many years in one capacity or another. My grandmother in the library, my mother in payroll, my Uncle John a groundskeeper, and my Uncle Tracy a campus police officer for a short time. All through school, I had all the same teachers that my mom and uncles had when they were growing up. People had a tendency to stay put in a town like Fullerton. I was the exception. Even though I had the same friends from preschool clear up through my senior year in high school, I never felt like I was a part of our community, and that they were all closer to each other than I was to any of them. And that is in spite of the fact that I was extremely popular and very good-looking as a boy. I had both of my parents' good looks and developed early for my age, tan and golden brown, and muscle-bound at the age of 13. A boxer, surfer, skateboarder, acting in the high school plays, always the leading man, and more girls crushing on me and chasing after me than I knew what to do with. I settled on one in high school. She was a junior when I was a freshman, an arrangement that was rare and scorned by my elder classmen. All the senior jocks wanted to kick my ass as it was because I had fucked a few of the senior cheerleaders. But my little junior sex pot outshined any of those common sluts. Her name was Violet. She was Puerto Rican and hailed from Chicago originally. Her father and brother were Latin Kings, one of the oldest and most notorious Hispanic gangs in the Midwest. She wore the shortest and tightest skirts in the whole school and had a body that sent 1,000 of our classmates off to bed at night to stroke their horny dicks off, to sleep then, dreaming of her in the arms of Morpheus. But Violet was no dream for me. She was all too real and 150% in love with me. We would ditch class and go to her house in the late morning while our parents were at work. She'd make sandwiches and chips and pour us big glasses of cherry Kool-Aid. Then we'd get on her bed and peel out of our clothes. She loved to suck my cock. She told me she would almost come just from feeling me throbbing in her mouth. Then she'd flip me over on my belly and would spread my ass open and would eat my asshole. Then we'd fuck until I shot cum all over her stomach and tits. Who needed algebra? We had everything we needed. Our young bodies, our undying lust for one another, our lunch in the late morning, while all the other kids slaved away over their books and quizzes, memorizing answers to tests, to pass classes, to get into colleges, to land degrees, to get jobs they really didn't want. They were all suckers in our eyes. We would drive our parents crazy by being on the phone with each other all night. Her dad would burst into her room and would shout, "Ay, coño, Violet. You guys are together all day at school and after school. Then you guys talk all night on the phone? It's too much." But we never listened. Violet and I would fuck anywhere we could. We'd climb up these storm drains onto the roof of the market behind my house and would fuck like wild dogs up there. I'd pull her thick, black, curly hair and pound my cock into her, slapping her perfect little ass. We'd fuck by the railroad tracks in broad daylight. The freight trains would come whipping by, the conductors blowing the train's horn, hooping and hollering at us as we fucked, her skirt hiked up over her ass, my pants down around my ankles, giving them a quick glance of a sex show as they sped by. It got her really wet when we did that. In the summer, we'd go to a water park in nearby San Dimas called Raging Waters. It had lots of thrilling water slides and a wave machine that made rolling waves that crowds of sunburned tourists floated on in inner tubes and that lapped on a sandy, man-made beach. We'd swim off to a little pirate-themed cove behind some rocks and would embrace. To passers-by, we looked like we were just floating there in each other's arms, but under the water, I'd have my cock out of my shorts and her bikini pulled to the side and would be fucking her as people swam all around us a few yards away. We'd go to Disneyland, too. First thing, we would find a quiet corner somewhere in the park and would smoke a blunt, then wander around eating candy apples and popcorn, going on the haunted house, and would laugh in stone delirium at the corny spooks popping up to scare us and the silly songs the animatronic dummies sang. Then we'd walk over to Tomorrowland, which was the 50s concept of what the future would look like. It had Space Mountain, an indoor roller coaster with rocket ship-shaped cars that whipped you through its dark interior, past whirling comets and clusters of stars. It was the fastest in the park and the only one of its kind in existence. Then, after the sun went down, we'd find another out-of-the-way corner to hit the blunt some more, and would get on the People Mover, which was a tram that took you on a tour inside and around all of the other attractions in Tomorrowland. We got in a tram with no other passengers, so we'd have it all to ourselves. First thing you passed through was the journey into inner space, a true-to-life scientific adventure into the world of atoms and molecules. You'd get in these little cars called atommobiles that took you through a giant microscope that gave you the sensation of being shrunk down and zapped into the vast universe inside a snowflake. Then you'd pass through Flight to Mars, which simulated a rocket mission to the Red Planet. Then over Autopia, where kids drove little cars on tracks that wound through the park. Then over the submarine ride. Violet would get my cock out midway through and suck me off as the skyway buckets passed overhead and the monorail whipped by. Then she'd straddle me and try to get off before the ride ended. We'd usually succeed. Some late afternoons, I'd borrow my mother's car and would go to pick her up from her house. She'd come running out wearing a very short, loose-fitting flower dress. She'd climb in the car and start sucking me off before I was even done backing out of her parents' driveway. I'd pull her dress up over her ass and would finger her pussy while she sucked my fat cock. One of the biggest thrills for her was getting caught. We'd drive to the train station. There was a parking structure there that was several stories high. We'd drive up to the very top and park. There were still a lot of cars parked there at that time of day, but it was the late afternoon and commuters were getting off their trains and going back to their cars to drive home. We'd walk over to the edge of the parking structure, and she'd bend over the railing, looking down at the floor below us at the people walking to their cars. I'd hike her dress up and pull it down off her shoulder so her tits were out. She'd moan and grind her ass up against me just a few feet above the unwitting passers-by. Had they looked up and over their shoulders, they would have seen Violet's beautiful, soft brown tits bouncing back and forth while I fucked the shit out of her. Just before I was about to orgasm, she'd get down on her knees and would swallow every drop of my hot cum. We'd get back in the car, kissing deeply, laughing at our daring, our freedom, our youth, our lust, smelling like spit, cum, and sweat. We'd go to Angelo and Vincie's Pizzeria, smoke a joint in the parking lot, get a nice out-of-the-way table in the dark restaurant, and would scarf down a hot, delicious pie. Life couldn't be any sweeter. One night we drove down to Laguna Beach and had a dinner at a little restaurant called Las Brisas. We had a table overlooking the ocean, and the moon was full and bright. After we ate, Violet reached across the table and took my hand, looked me in the eye, slipped an engagement ring onto my finger, and asked me to marry her. That's how serious we were. I accepted, and the whole restaurant exploded with applause. We embraced and kissed and cried a little. I felt bad because I wasn't expecting this to happen. I didn't have a ring for her, but she said she didn't care, that she knew I'd get her a nice wedding ring when we got married. A nice older couple sent over a bottle of champagne and toasted to us. It felt pretty damn magical. Adults like to think that young love, puppy love, is whimsical and fleeting, which in most cases it is, but it is also monumentally intense. Young people exude romantic love the way a baby rattlesnake will inject venom into its prey. They don't know how to measure how much they inject, and will use it all with one bite, exhausting themselves. And Violet and I had a painfully powerful need for each other, both emotionally and physically. It was way too adult for any teenage couple to be so invested in. Way too adult for adults to be invested in, for that matter. We would regularly get in heated verbal and often physical fights. Most of the physical violence started in the form of sexual play. She expressed a very intense need to be dominated and roughed up. It was her favorite thing. Hair pulling, slapping across the face, choking, being spit on, all of which was new to me at that age. It never occurred to me prior to her insistence on engaging in such behaviors that women would want anything like that done to them. I did, however, take to it like a fish to water. An innate instinct understood wholly what it all meant and why it felt good to play that way. It was animal, primal, inducing endorphins that were drop-kicked into the brain, getting you high on the raw, psychosexual physicality of it all. All too common by today's standards, I know, but it was new and wild and powerful to us as young, highly sexual people in those formative years. But the fighting was also triggered by jealousy, being that we were both so sought after for our looks and sexual exuberance. A lot of people, male and female, would regularly make plays for our attention. If a girl came up to me in the quad and started flirting with me, Violet would come charging up and would pull me aside and start in on me, throwing heavy, angry shade at the girl with dagger eyes, warning her to back the fuck off. We'd walk home across the field after school and would be screaming and pulling each other's hair and chasing each other down the street. And if I saw her talking to one of the football players or some other handsome jerk, I'd come up and threaten the dude and drag her away kicking and screaming. What was odder and most disturbing still was that we would often fantasize about us being with other people. We'd get all worked up talking about bringing in another girl, her fucking other girls without me, and her even being with other guys. We'd talk about different scenarios and get so horny we'd sneak off somewhere and fuck. We were pretty twisted for our age, as far as most people were concerned. We'd fight so bad sometimes that we'd have little breakups, and I wouldn't talk to her for weeks. I'd have my mother blow her off when she'd call, and would avoid her at school. One night during such a period, I was walking down the street in the early evening. I was passing some hedges next to the sidewalk when, out of the blue, I felt Violet jump on my back, wrapping her arm around my neck, and pounding me in the face with her other hand, over and over again. Her legs were wrapped around my waist. She was strong and strapped to me like a little monkey. I, in turn, and shamefully, would hit her too, always feeling terribly remorseful afterwards. It had me hearken back to the stories of my great-grandfather being abusive to my grandfather and his brother, and my grandfather being abusive to my father and his brothers, and my father being abusive with my mother. Being witness to these behaviors and them somehow seeping into my own uncontrollable narcissistic rage, jealousy, and insecurities. It was pathetic and sick. But it was all around us. Violet's father had done the same with her mother, and her brother with his wives and girlfriends. Other young couples that were friends of ours often acted out with each other in the same way. Drunken, screaming matches at parties between long-term couples were constant and always turned physical, escalated into something very ugly and embarrassing, and ended in tearful apologies. It was a whole generation of people in love, unable to handle the rigors of a mature romantic relationship. I once had a longer than usual breakup with Violet after a particularly dark and violent episode. I went overboard one night and hurt her very badly. I was absolutely sick with grief and guilt, and decided that we just weren't healthy for one another. We didn't talk or even see each other around school for over a month. In an attempt to get over our breakup, I went to a winter formal with a Vietnamese girl from Fullerton High School. She invited me and was a very sweet and lovely girl, and for the most part just a friend. We had a real high school dance experience, complete with a group photo with her and her friends in our gowns and tuxedos, a drunken limo ride into L.A. down Hollywood Boulevard, having the driver pull over when one of us had to puke from our overambitious binge drinking, clumsily fondling and dry humping through our formal wear, crushing our corsages and wrinkling our pressed trousers and shirts, the whole 9 yards. Afterwards, when the limo dropped us off at my date's place, we walked around to the alley behind her house to enter through the backyard. We stopped dead in our tracks and gasped at what we saw there in front of their garage. Her car, a little red Honda Civic, had been totally and utterly destroyed. The tires slashed, every window shattered, the interior sliced apart and gutted of the stuffing, the dashboard smashed with hammer marks dug deep into the foam inside. It was a complete disaster, a total loss. It was 100% and without a single doubt in my mind, none other than Violet and her dirty work. I didn't say that to my date, but she knew Violet and what she was capable of. She glared at me with a hurt and shocked eye. I apologized profusely and told her I would never have agreed to come along if I thought for a second that Violet would do such a thing. I left her there with tears in her eyes. I walked home in my disheveled tux, cummerbund off and shoved in my jacket pocket, dress shoes killing my feet, fuming with anger. I was going to strangle Violet for fucking that poor girl over like that. I couldn't wait to find her. But as it turned out, I wouldn't have to wait at all. When I got to my driveway, I saw Violet laying down under my mom's car asleep, waiting for me. She was in a hoodie and a pair of shorts, and was barefoot. I grabbed her by the hoodie and dragged her out from under my mom's car. She woke up and instantly clamped down on my arm with her sharp nails and clung to me with her legs wrapped around my waist, clawing at my face, screaming like a banshee. "How did your little gook whore like what I did to her car, huh?" she wailed. "You fucking crazy bitch! She didn't deserve that! We're just friends, you fucking nut job!" I screamed, dragging her behind our garage, away from the front of the house, out of sight. I pried her off of me and threw her on the ground, jumped on top of her and covered her mouth. She started weeping. I saw the pain in her eyes. It wasn't the pain of the scrap we were in, but of the heartache I was causing her. She just loved me more than she knew how to cope with, more than either of us knew how to cope with. I still loved her too, in spite of all the turmoil. We clung to each other there on the grass behind our garage, a desperate clinging, one that felt that if you let go, the darkness above would tear us from the earth and launch us out into the empty void. I felt her soften underneath me, and my grip becoming tender, the both of us surrendering. We laid there wrapped in each other, our tears, our skin torn, our eyes red, wrists bruised, sweating, trying to catch our breath, swallow our pride, forgive and forget. We kissed deep and hard and made love there in the darkness, listening to the crickets and the cold wind and our hearts pounding in our chests. She graduated the next year. We were working things out. She got a job at a drugstore as a checkout clerk and an apartment with a roommate. But with her not being with me all day at school, I played around all the time. I couldn't control myself. I cheated on her with dozens of girls. There were just too many beautiful young women pining after me, such easy prey, waiting for me to move in. I simply couldn't resist. Violet got bored with her minimum wage job, her crummy apartment and flaky roommate, and decided to quit out of the blue to join the Marines. She was lured in by a handsome recruiter who was handing out pamphlets in front of her store and decided to go to the local recruiting office to listen to what they had to say. They, of course, promised her the moon and stars, as they're apt to do with young, disenfranchised kids from working-class neighborhoods with very few options. Travel, adventure, money for college, a career, all at your fingertips. It was peacetime, and we knew little of world affairs. We didn't know of the troubles brewing in the Middle East, and naively thought that since she was from California, they would station her at nearby Camp Pendleton down in Oceanside. She had nothing to lose, so what the hell? It wasn't too long after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, stirring up a shitstorm on the world stage. Violet got shipped overseas after recruit training to Camp Smedley D. Butler Marine Base in Okinawa, Japan. The Gulf War broke out, and our military was on high alert, and she was on standby to deploy at any given moment. She would call me on occasion and would tell me how they would get outfitted in full battle gear, armed and ready, and would stand on the tarmac in formation in the cold morning air before the sun was even up, waiting to board personnel transports bound for Kuwait City. The call to deploy never came, but she would not be allowed to come home for the holidays or any other reason for that matter, for 2 whole years. This time away from each other, coupled with the fact that she was one of about 1,000 women on a base of 14,000 male Marines, was essentially the end of us. She got word from our friends at school of my endless philandering, had time to think of all the conflict, the jealousy, the controlling, and the need to be controlled, the shabby way we went about the whole thing, and had had enough. She was surrounded by big, strapping, handsome men in uniform on a tropical island in the China Sea, some 6,500 miles away. She, of course, had many sexual encounters with her fellow Marines, and finally met one she fell head over heels for. He was a stunningly handsome and dashing black man in dress blues from Louisiana, the body of a god, dark skin, rippling muscles, huge cock, and this time she got a ring put on her finger. She sent me a Dear John letter from Okinawa, explaining that she was in love with another man and was moving on. It hurt like hell, not just because we had actually had a good last couple of years together before she left with very little fighting, but also because I couldn't argue with her reasoning. I knew all the cheating I was doing. How mad could I seriously be at her for falling for this guy? I would be a hypocrite. I was a hypocrite. They had 2 beautiful little girls in the next few years. She discharged from the Marine Corps and stayed home with the babies while he re-enlisted. They lived on base in a little home the Marines provided for enlisted men with small families. It was perfect for her. I graduated high school, went for 1 semester of junior college, then moved up to L.A. and went through my adventures, bad romances, and growing pains. I kept in touch with Violet over the years. We managed to stay friends and were able to laugh about our wild and wanton youth. How we were in some ways each other's first marriage. A practice run of sorts maybe, working out all the kinks, all the what not to do's. At least that's how I like to think about it. But it isn't how it turned out. Violet's happily ever after didn't last long. She found out the man she married ended up cheating on her several times when she was pregnant, both times. There were fights, cops called, breakups, and finally, tragically, her husband, the father of her 2 children, died. Not in combat, but by flying over the handlebars of his motorcycle. And even though they had been divorced for some time, she was absolutely broken over it, utterly devastated. Her and her kids moved back to Fullerton and lived in one of the most run-down apartment buildings in the city, the kind you see with dozens of kids running around all day in the courtyard unsupervised, the parents unemployed and getting high and drunk all day, hanging out on their balconies and talking shit. Violet struggled to find work and managed to get by with the help of her family. She tried to find love, too, but always hooked up with the same kind of guys, cheating, abusive, deadbeats. Until one day, she just shut it all down. She stopped trying, stopped dating, trying to fall in love, or even having sex at all. She didn't even masturbate anymore. A far cry from the hotter-than-lava fuck monster she was when we were kids. I couldn't help to think over the years that I was directly responsible, that I set the standard of shit that she came to accept from men and how they treated her. Although I expressed deep, unrelenting remorse to her directly over the years ad nauseum, I never got over that guilt, in spite of her insistence that it was not my fault. I still felt to blame, however. I thought of Violet in her run-down apartment, out of love, out of lust, out of the ability to cope with another disappointing man, struggling to feed and clothe her children alone. No one there to step up and fill that void, including myself. And me, off in the big city, living it up, drinking, drugging, fucking, playing rock and roll, selfishly indulging in every decadence for close to 2 decades. My once golden skin, white and scarred, swollen with fat, stretch marked, my hair all but gone, my ankle fractured and clicking when I walked, my knees sprained and arthritic, my once blue eyes, once gleaming with ambition and enthusiasm, now a tired and jaded gray. Once golden, carefree, optimistic, though innocent and naive, though reckless, now cynical, pessimistic, oversexed, overfed, burned out, exposed to too much, too fast, too often, and now a tarnished brass. I drove past our house on Clark Avenue. The street hadn't been repaved in decades and was covered in cracks from wear and tear, the hot sun, the torrential rains that came through in the winter months, and the little earthquakes that constantly rumble under our feet here in Southern California. Our house looked more run down than any other on the block. The new renters just passing through for a few years and couldn't care less. The grass was overgrown, the fences falling down, my grandmother's rose bushes unkempt and underwatered, the orange tree in the backyard still bustling with oranges, overripe and rotting. I parked across the street from our driveway where Violet slept under my mother's car, lying in wait for me to come home, to tear out my eyes, to tear out my heart, for breaking hers. The bushes behind the garage where we fought and made love were still there, taller, untrimmed and shady, an ancient ruin of my youth, of our little American dream, of heady times, the halcyon years of my childhood. The real and ugly world in our faces now, all the dire and inevitable troubles of our age that we ran so freely from with strong legs, healthy lungs and hearts, fierce and determined eyes, mired now in the mud of adulthood. It broke my heart. I watched the sun fall on all of it, just a shell of a man, watching the dark descend on what was once my Eden, my lost paradise. I had been cast out, and for good reason.